Time doesn't erase murder. It just hides it better. They said the case was closed. They said no one was watching. But someone always is. Enter the shadows, where every whisper is a clue, and the line between justice and obsession disappears. This is Santana True Crime.
Welcome to Santana True Crime. Tonight we've got a special guest all the way across the pond. I have Mary. Mary is from the UK and she is a professional researcher and scriptwriter for her podcast. So she's leaving her desk and actually getting in front of the camera for the first time. We are going to be discussing the oldest cold case that's solved in UK history, the case of Louisa Dunne. Mary, welcome to the show.
Hi, and thank you for having me on.
So this is such an interesting case, especially the time that's gone by, and I think it's a really positive for law enforcement to just show that cases from the 60s can get solved. What drew you to this case originally?
Because of the research and the writing, you're always kind of keeping an eye on cases that are interesting. I've got quite an international collection of cases that I keep an eye on. And the news algorithm knows me so well that I get sent all the headlines on various cases that are interesting, especially historical cases, because I do love my primary sources, being able to dig through the archives. And this got thrown up because, as you said, one of the oldest cold cases to be cracked. I think the only correction I would have to say is it's definitely one of the oldest cold cases within England and Wales. Scotland and Northern Ireland do have a different legal system to us, so they may have their own oldest cold case, potentially.
Yeah, it's very impressive. Let's jump right into it. So we know that on June 28th, 1967, that's when Louisa's body was discovered. Can you explain the area of Bristol where she was located?
Yeah, so believe it or not, I actually have a friend who lives in Bristol, and I'm not sure if she's in the same area. No, she isn't. She doesn't live in the same area. However, it's got a bit contemporary. Bristol has a bit of a mixed base of your typical metropolitan city, and then sort of like there's always that sort of neighborhood that's a bit, don't go walking in it late at night if you're a young lady, would sort of be the advice. It's a little bit rougher. Back in the 60s, it was very much a working man's city. You'd be hard pressed not to find someone. Let me rephrase that. You would struggle to find someone who didn't support the Labour Party, which was the left-wing party at the time, which is actually relevant to this case in a bit.
So it's a left-wing party. We call it the Democratic Party in the U.S.
Yes.
I assume this
Yes.
is like labor unions and more of
Yeah.
blue collar is what we would refer it to, the working
Yeah.
man's party,
Yeah.
that type of thing.
Yeah, very much so. Back then, it very much was so. There's a whole history lesson in sort of like how the Labour Party has evolved since then, as all political parties do. But Bristol was very much a working man's sort of town, very industrialized. You had very normal people. There weren't a lot of the higher class members of society in Bristol. They tended to move away from Bristol
this is
as
kind
they
of a
moved up the class
working.
ranks.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So like a working class, lower end of the economic ladder type neighborhood,
Yeah, pretty much.
but not the
Popular culture.
slums.
It's not the slums, no. Probably a good reference would be from popular culture at the minute. If you watch the Craze movie, the movie about my God, I always struggle to pronounce the name. The Cray brothers.
Okay.
Occasion to call them the Crazy Brothers because of Reggie. But yeah. So if you sort of look at the kind of working class individuals from the Cray movie, or look at, although it's based in the West Midlands, Birmingham area, Peaky Blinders as well.
Okay, I think everyone's seen Peaky Blinders.
Yeah. So the pub that they operate in there, that would be every pub in Bristol where it's all working men.
Okay, I mean, it sounds like a good time there. So we know that she's about 58 years old, and she was actually found by
75.
a neighbor, right?
Yes, 75. I do have to correct you on that one,
Okay.
because the case is 58 years at the time that they solved it, and she did live at 58 Britannia Road.
Okay, I'm
Um,
sorry about that.
so
So glad. Thank you
it's
for
fine.
correcting me on that. So she's 75, which is even more interesting because a neighbor finds her body, but not to jump ahead, but we know
Yes,
that she was also raped during this
yes,
assault.
yes. I'm actually quite glad that you pointed that out because it does become it is a detail that you need to bear in mind as we sort of dig into the case a lot more. It is definitely an important element of the MO, shall we say,
So can you
especially
talk
when you
about
find
how
out
her body was
the discovery.
found or who found her?
So it was bear with me 2 seconds. I've got to get a name. I know it's Violet. So what happened? The prosecutor actually summed this up absolutely fantastically during the trial. What happened was a bunch of her neighbors were very aware of the fact that Louisa wasn't hanging around on her doorstep by roughly 11 o'clock in the morning on the 28th of June. So they got very concerned because that was out of the norm behavior. And so they sort of gather around and start sort of having a look to see what's happened. They noticed that one of the windows, the one especially by the front door, was wide open, which was very unusual for Louisa. She was very security conscious. And so that set alarm bells ringing, that something was wrong. They were hollering for her through the letterbox. They were calling through, trying to get a peek through the window, but they're also trying to call for her. And that is when a Violet Allen, who was also a friend of Louisa's, had a look through the window and saw her legs as she was laying on the floor. She just saw her legs sort of very ominously sticking out. It was at that point that she's just like, yep, no, I need to get in there, see what's happening. With the help of two other ladies that had gathered round out of concern for Louisa, she climbed through the window. And when she reached over to Louisa, who was laying on the floor on a pile of clothes, she had a scarf underneath her head as well. She reached out, touched her hand. So minimal contamination of the crime scene beyond sort of like climbing through the window to gain access and reaching out and touching her hand. She was ice cold, which for June in the UK, bear in mind it's August, so it should be starting to turn towards autumn now. And it's still quite warm. We're in the middle of a heat wave. In June, it's even warmer. So ice cold body, it means death. That was when they kind of raised the alarm. They called the local GP, they called for an ambulance, and obviously the police were called as well.
What is the GP? Can you explain that?
Okay, so it's GP is your general practitioner.
Okay.
It's your local doctors.
So and maybe times have changed, but in 1967 or in the 60s, they would call a GP if there was a suspicious death, or is this just kind of a
They
general practice for any death?
That's general practice for any death. It's literally so that they can sign the death certificate.
Okay.
It's literally just to pronounce her dead.
Okay.
Paramedics couldn't do that.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, they can take it. So if you are in an ambulance and you pass away, it's a DOA, then the paramedics will take note of when the patient became deceased, and they pass it on to the doctors at the hospital, and the doctors put that information down.
Okay, that's it. So in the US, if
Yeah.
someone dies in their house, you just have to
Mm.
make a phone call to their doctor, and if you're a police officer, and explain the circumstances, and they essentially just sign off on it.
Yeah.
They never, of course, go out to the scene. Um,
The doctor in this one did.
that is interesting. So let's talk about who Louisa was. Where did she grow up? Can you tell us about her early life, and that way
Yeah.
we can know about our
So
victim?
so Louisa's actually like she definitely lived a full life before her passing. There was some tragedy towards the end. I don't have a set birth date for her as such. However, given the time period of 1892, you can imagine it's a little bit difficult to track down a birth certificate for that time
Right.
period, if there was one. Now, she was originally born in Gloucestershire, which is sort of the next, I guess you guys would call them counties,
Okay.
which is sort of a few counties over. And somewhere between 1892, when she was born, and 1915, she moved to Bristol. In 1915, she married a lovely gentleman named Edwin Teddy Parker. All of his mates called him Teddy. He was commonly known as Teddy. And he was a city councillor. The couple then went on to have two daughters, Edna and Iris. And the whole family was very much in support of Teddy's career as a local politician. And it definitely paid off, because by the sort of like 1940s, he was a rising star. He was on track to become mayor of Bristol, which obviously would have made Louisa mayoress. In that time period, again, referring back to Peaky Blinders and such, the wife of any esteemed political party, they've all got to be pristine, up to check. It's very first lady is always seen with the president, that sort of thing. Although arguably the first lady has more independence in comparison to now. Sorry, let me rephrase it. The first lady now would have more independence in comparison to what Louisa would have had if she ended up being the mayoress, a title that she only could have earned because of being married to Teddy if he had become mayor. And his career very much took over her social life. It was pretty much, her social life was charming people, attending all the social events that he had to attend. I think her granddaughter even turned around and said that Louisa's social life was so revolved so much around Teddy's career that there's no photos of her by herself. Unfortunately, in the early 1940s, Teddy's career kind of did have to drop off and come to an end, because he spent so much time in the hospital having had a stroke. Although he still somehow managed to stay political and stay in that career, that sphere. There is a picture somewhere of Teddy Parker and Louisa as he's in a hospital bed being wheeled into a polling station for one of the local, I can't remember if it was a local poll or a general election poll, but even then he was still involved in the politics. Unfortunately, he died in 1945, and that very much was the start of tragedy within Louisa's life. She turned to alcohol to cope with the massive loss of her husband, which unfortunately led to a massive rift between her and her two daughters. They completely cut contact. I think the last time she saw one of her daughters was 6 years before her death. So she became quite the recluse, even from her own family. However, In 1952, she was sort of getting back into being social again because she ended up marrying a night watchman, a John Dunne. Unfortunately, in 1961, he passed away. And so Louisa just became even more of a recluse. Although she was still so popular from her time supporting Teddy that she was struggling to become a recluse. She just became less social and less outgoing, but she would often be seen standing on her doorstep, watching the world go by. She would have general conversations with anyone who stopped and swung by. She was on amazing terms with her neighbors. They would leave the daily newspapers out for her to read the next day so that she could keep up with the world. She would often be seen walking to and from the shops, doing a little grocery shopping and that. And she'd occasionally go around and see very close friends, but this was a very occasional sort of thing. She wasn't as outgoing as she used to be.
Yeah, that's quite a change
Yeah.
from you're living the kind of in that celebrity status and going to these
Yeah,
higher class
quite the
parties
yeah,
to just
the
going down that
socialite.
downward, spiral
Yeah,
there. That's pretty
yeah,
evident.
socialite to social recluse. It To be fair though, her granddaughter did say that after the death of Teddy Parker, Louisa did face what could be described as a breakdown. Definitely back then it would have been described as a breakdown because, well, she lost so much of her life structure and
Right.
then further losing contact with her daughters because of the rift created by alcoholism. It was just a spiral.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you pointed those things out because some of the I've looked at this case briefly, and that aspect of where she was before being this having this massive social life and her husband almost becoming mayor and her going to these parties. I didn't really get that from what I watched. It looked like she was coming from the recluse part was very evident, and it almost
Yeah.
sounded like she, you know, all that was reported was her alcoholism and that she was from kind of
Mm,
a lower in neighborhood. But let's talk about the day of the murder. Uh, and we hit
yeah.
on this briefly before, but what do we know about what happened right before the murder?
So the day before the murder, we do actually have witness testimony, which was provided during the trial, of two individuals who saw her on the 27th of June, 1967. That's going to happen a while. It's going to happen a few times in this. I do apologize if I get my numbers mixed up. I swear I've got the numbers version of dyslexia sometimes. Now, around about 15 minutes past 5 in the sort of late afternoon, evening on the 27th, Louisa did actually go around to visit a friend of hers, a very dear friend named Alice Clark. And she left Alice Clark's at about 7:30 in the evening. I do have a lovely description of what sort of like the vibe was for the evening, in which Alice Clark describes that they had some custard and stewed gooseberries because that was a very typical sort of treat to have. It was a very typical sweet treat to have in those
What is
times.
a gooseberry? I've never heard of one of those before.
Oh, have you never heard of a
No,
gooseberry?
no, no. Custard,
Oh
I
my gosh.
understand that, but gooseberry, is that an actual fruit or is that a dessert
Yes,
that
it is. Gooseberries are real berries. They
wow,
are real berry. You can have gooseberry jam. You can have stewed gooseberry, which not far off from gooseberry jam, just less sugar.
okay.
Yeah. No, they are genuine. It is a genuine berry. It's a
So this is
bit
a
of an
common thing
acquired
to have.
taste. Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely in that time period, and gooseberries are quite common in the UK. Or at least gooseberry flavored things are quite common to have in the UK. I've also had some gooseberries overseas. I personally think that they are delicious. It's a bit of a it's a bit of the Marmite fruit, if that makes sense. Some people absolutely love it. Some people they just get put off by it. I personally actually do really like gooseberry. I'd probably say the best introduction to gooseberry jam, if you can ever get hold of any, is trying it on toast.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to find someone that can bring me some gooseberry. Uh, so she's pretty much having just kind of a typical good night from what it looks like. I mean, she's
Yep.
meeting a friend. They're having custard and gooseberry. I guess you can't get any better than that. And we know that a neighbor that was walking her dog had seen her
Yeah.
standing by her doorstep about 10 p.m.
Yep.
And so this isn't
So
a case where she's walking around and maybe she's got someone that follows her back home and pushes her inside. I mean, she's in her safe space,
yep.
essentially. She's on her doorstep till 10
Yeah,
p.m.
that adds, as well as her age, that adds to the horror of it, was the fact that it's just like the personal space being completely violated. And the fact that it's an elderly lady. And bear in mind, she's also like tiny. She is a tiny lady. She's 5'3". She weighs less than oh god, American, you
She's
guys use
about 100
pounds,
pounds.
don't you?
Yeah.
She's less than 100 pounds.
Okay, so she's like tiny. Yes.
Yeah,
Very
she's tiny.
frail.
For context, the last time I weighed as much as she did, I was 12.
And for those that are not watching this on YouTube, you're obviously not a big person.
No, I think the most complimentary description I've had of my figure is I'm quite lithe.
That's very funny.
But yeah, so I did actually do some international conversions here. So she weighed less than 7 stone. She weighed less than 98 pounds and less than 44 kgs.
Okay. So small
Yeah.
lady
So she's,
again.
yeah,
And
she's 5'3".
when we're thinking about this from a perspective of if someone did see her standing there and they are trying to find someone that is vulnerable, you've got a very small lady
Oh yeah,
that's in her
prime
70s.
target.
And right. And he probably figured out that she's living alone. From the pictures that I saw, it looked like the houses were pretty close together though.
Yeah. So Louisa lived in what we call a terraced house. I'm going to end up referring back to Peaky Blinders like so much. When you've got that like down the street view of the houses in Peaky Blinders, and you see how all of the front doors are literally like windows apart.
Yes.
So you maybe have like 2 windows between each door, or sometimes you have 2 front doors right next to each other.
Right.
Those are called terraced houses, except for the houses at the end. Those are end of terrace houses, obviously, because they're at the end of the terrace. And basically what that means is if you're in a terraced house, the wall that marks the end of your house on either side also marks the beginning of someone else's house. So you could literally, if you've got a noisy neighbor, you could literally lean over, bang on the wall behind you, behind you, next to you, whatever, depending on where you're staying in the terraced house, and you're banging on their wall.
Okay. So these are like
the houses are
townhouses.
literally the next room. Yeah.
Okay. So we hit on the murder scene itself, but let's
Yeah.
go into the investigation. So obviously the community is upset about that. She had obviously been robbed, raped, and murdered during the attack. And she was found in the front room, lying on a pile of clothes, and her underwear were around her ankles, which is why they knew that she was raped. And
Yep.
do you want to go into the bruising and abrasions that were found on her during the
Yeah,
autopsy?
yeah, of course. So the pathologist in his autopsy report made a definite note that specifically her lips, definitely where they would have been pressed against her teeth, there was a lot of bruising, abrasions, and there were tears as well. So she was clearly like having her lips pressed right up against her teeth. She was probably trying to move her mouth as well. And the pathologist basically came to the conclusion that something firm was pressed up against her mouth, most likely a hand. Pretty firm. I mean, we know it's a male perpetrator because she was raped. And that's what the pathologist came to the conclusion was, that there was a firm hand pressed up against her. The other thing that I would maybe suggest possibly caused the bruising around her mouth area is also mentioned in the autopsy, in which there was a straight line of bruising across the back of her neck. And due to the placement of the scarf that was found behind her head, the pathologist also had the opinion that the bruising from the back of her neck was caused by the scarf being tied around her face with such
Yeah, that makes
force
sense.
that it bruised.
Maybe he tried to gag her, or
Yeah.
and then use that to
Mm.
strangle her afterwards. That would kind of make
Yeah.
sense.
Well, the cause of death, there's almost two contributing factors to her death. It is the fact it's asphyxiation via strangulation and pressure to the mouth. Just lightly paraphrasing what the pathologist said.
So essentially, he covered up her mouth with something while he's choking her.
Yeah.
I thought this was, we've got to keep in mind that this is in the 60s again, where DNA they're not using yet, but they do take semen samples,
Yeah.
and they took some other swabs of her body, which was really good, especially again
Mhm.
during this time period. And during that time, they were able to take semen and get a blood type from it. And they were also
Yeah.
able to determine if someone was a secretor or a non-secretor. So they could
It's
do
I've researched a case about that. It's so
yeah.
gross.
So I learned about the whole secretor and non-secretor when I was researching my book, A Murder on Campus, The Professor, the
Yeah.
Cop, and North Carolina's most notorious cold case, where with Virginia Olsen in that case, the same thing. They took a semen sample, which they ended up losing later, but they were able to determine, the blood type and the secretor status.
Yeah.
And we know they also got a palm print from this,
Yes.
which
Oh,
was
yes, the controversial
another
palm print.
very important aspect. And I think that when you're looking at these things, what I think about too is the police or law enforcement during this case, they do a really good job, especially in the
Oh, yeah.
60s. They're actually swabbing the body, they're getting samples, they're getting prints. And when I've researched other cases around this time, it's a disaster.
Yeah.
So,
Um,
we've got to give them some credit.
I think that the fact that they threw their all into this investigation just makes it even more devastating when you find out about the suspect. A little bit of foreshadowing there, but because they were working so hard on solving this case, they were giving it their all. That actually just makes the fact that it took so long to solve even more heartbreaking, because they actually could have done it. They actually could have solved this case like in 67 if they'd just pushed that teeny tiny tiny bit further. And it's actually really heartbreaking because you don't know how many of those original investigators are still alive to see this case be put to bed and be put to rest. It's absolutely heartbreaking because they were
Well,
so
and let's
close
get into
and their
that
work
because
was paid.
that was another really impressive thing that I found is they had the palm print and they treated it like we do DNA now, where if a murder
Yeah.
happens and we know it's a stranger rape, which is a very rare occurrence in law enforcement.
Yeah.
Normally, the
Yeah.
victim knows the attacker. So when you have those
Oh,
stranger
yeah.
rapes where there's a murder, you're going to go around an area and collect DNA samples from all the males in that area. And a lot of times that looks like knocking on door after door, making contact with the male, and seeing if
Yep.
they will submit to a sample. And they're doing that
Yep.
with palm prints during this time.
Yeah. So the numbers that were thrown around was 20,000 fingerprints and palm prints were taken from men and boys, and they did over 8,000 house-to-house calls in the area. The search parameter was pretty wide.
Yeah, again, it's so impressive
Yeah.
that they put that much. When I look at the man
Oh, yeah.
hours that they've spent on this, I
They were
mean,
not sparing any pennies. They were going all out on this investigation. There was no budget for manpower on this one.
again, so impressive. And they, hopefully the investigators and the officers that worked on this were alive to, you know, to see this guy brought to justice. They also had some
Oh god,
witness
yeah.
statements, which we can kind of narrow down the time of death
Yeah.
due to that. Can you go into some of the things that were heard?
Yeah, of course. So the pathologist pretty much said that Louisa had passed away between 10 p.m. on the 27th and 4 a.m. on the 28th, except due to the witness statements that were later used as testimony, we can actually narrow it down to more likely to be just after midnight, as you had individuals such as Violet Fortune, who lived very close to Louisa's house at the time. They'd gone to bed just after 12 o'clock, and no, sorry, they'd just before 12 o'clock, midnight. And she says, I was awoken suddenly by what sounded like a scream. It wasn't a long, piercing scream, but like crying out. It sounded muffled. I got out of bed and went to the window. I could see up and down the road by the light of the moon, but there was no one in sight. I stood at the window for about a minute and then got back into bed. I'd been back in bed for 2 minutes when I heard someone cry out. I could distinguish it was a female voice of a woman. It lasted for about 2 or 3 seconds. So that kind of tells you that by the time she was awoken just after midnight, um, the perpetrator was already in the house because no one was out in the street. She couldn't see anyone on Britannia Road at the time, and perpetrators inside. You know exactly when the attack's happening. The muffling of the scream does also back up what the pathologist said about the scarf and the hand being pressed against Louisa's mouth. You then have a Sydney Gibbs. Now, his back garden, because what you normally have is sometimes you'll have a front garden, sometimes you won't. With these properties, and then behind you have to walk through the house to get through the back garden. His back garden backed up onto Britannia Road.
Okay.
So if you hopped a fence off Britannia Road, you were hopping into his back garden, but he didn't live on Britannia Road, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah. He said that something woke him up. He didn't know what it was, but it definitely woke him up. And then his daughter woke up screaming, which was very unusual because she was sleeping through the night. That was at around about 12:20, so 20 minutes past midnight. He tucked his daughter back into bed, but he didn't look out any of the windows at the time. So he couldn't really see anything. But again, if you're hearing the screams, the perpetrator's already inside, so you're not really going to see anything. And then a Harold Hodson gave a statement as well, saying that he was woken up by his dog, and then he heard a loud scream. It was a frightening scream. It was obviously an adult woman. It sounded as if someone was being attacked, which we now know they were. There was a sound I can only describe as moans or being muffled. There were 3 or 4 of these moans. So now we've got 3 completely independent witnesses giving a statement saying that it was definitely after midnight, but before 1 a.m. that the attack probably happened, which lines up with what the pathologist said of it happening before 4 a.m. on the 28th.
You know what's kind of interesting about this, and maybe it just wasn't documented, is that no one calls the police or no one investigates it further.
Mm.
You've got multiple people there hearing these things, and they all acknowledge that these are odd to hear a woman scream, especially a muffled scream.
Yeah. So the thing about that, there's 2 different reasons for that. It's the diffusal of responsibility, they call it in psychology, in which there's the assumption that someone else will do it. Oh, I'm not the only one I'm not the only one that would have heard it. Someone else has done it. Someone else will do it. Bear in mind, these people can't actually see each other in their houses and what the other person's doing. So there may be that natural assumption of like, oh, well, so-and-so across the road, their lights on, they would have heard it, they would have dealt with it. They also don't know exactly where the scream's coming from. So they're just going to say, oh, well, something's happening on Britannia Road. The cops are kind of going to go like, well, we don't know exactly where to go. The other thing is, it is 1967 in a very working class neighborhood. It's not a well-to-do area. And so telephones aren't necessarily installed in the houses. You probably have people relying on the payphones, the little red phone boxes.
So no one wants to
very
leave. Yeah, no one wants to leave their house to walk to a payphone to call the police or law enforcement. Yeah, well, that makes more sense. I'm glad you pointed those things out.
Yeah.
So we've got this evidence. We've got the palm print. They've taken semen samples. They've got witness statements. It looks like the police are doing a really good job. And for 58 years, they are doing what we call like a review, where you essentially see if there's any new evidence throughout the time, and if there's a new technological advance, and you'll resubmit the evidence to your lab to see if you can get a pop. And so the police are doing this, and for the longest time, they're not getting anything. Do you want to tell us about when a forensic scientist does screen Louisa's skirt for male DNA cells?
Yeah. So just a quick note, because as you said, they were doing constant reviews. This wasn't the first review that they did of Louisa's case. They took a crack at it in 2009, and they took another crack at it in 2014, and then they had a crack at it. It got brought up for review in 2023, and then obviously the forensics lab. Bear with me 2 seconds, and I'll get the name of the forensics lab for you as well. If not even just the name of the forensic scientist that did it. Because the senior supervisor of the case lead, shall we say, he actually mentioned the forensic lab that did it. It was Southwest Forensics.
Okay.
They got hold of it, and they were the ones who did the case breaking. They did the breakthrough analysis.
So is this a private lab that Southwest Forensics?
Sort of. The forensics labs are quite different from the ones that you use in America. So sometimes you guys will, I say you guys, sometimes American law enforcement, as highlighted in the Idaho case, the 4 college students who were murdered. If a police law enforcement agency at a state level are sort of overwhelmed by a case, they can sort of reach out to the FBI and almost borrow their resources and obtain guidance.
Right.
In the UK, we don't have that. You have all the resources that you have unless you go private.
That's what I was wondering. So in some cases, so for example, Othram is, I think I'm saying that correctly, is one of the best private labs, and they're in Texas. And so sometimes the capabilities of a state lab will not be good enough to be able to get DNA. So
Yeah.
from my understanding, Othram only needs 16 cells to be able to create a DNA profile. And, and they're kind of at the cutting edge of technology, where others may take a lot longer because they're overwhelmed, or they just don't have the technical ability to be able to, do it with limited resources. I thought that was interesting too, that they got these cells from her skirt. And we know that they had a semen sample, and I was wondering if the semen sample deteriorated, or do you?
So I wanted this as well. I did actually have a look into this because it was something that was quite interesting. So back in the 60s, they could test for semen, and they could sort of do a lot of like research on the semen. However, the amount of testing that you do on the semen sample, it does deteriorate the sample. So it's very similar to how when they do blood tests, they take multiple vials depending on how many tests they want to run. You need a greater sample if you are going to be running multiple tests. And over time, DNA is one of the most difficult things to keep sort of stable, make sure it doesn't deteriorate, especially when it's a sample of it on a swab, because you've got all sorts of factors contaminating it, deteriorating. I mean, it's within a couple of hours that sperm actually loses its tail. You can tell how old sperm is by how much of a tail it does or does not have. So unfortunately, the semen samples that they did take through testing and time, they were too deteriorated for them to do anything. So testing the skirt, I personally think it actually makes a lot of sense, because I don't know if you ever faced it in your career, but if you have someone who has been raped and they're wearing jeans, there was, the rapist unfortunately got their way, and they basically did actually manage to ejaculate. There's usually trace of the sperm on the victim's jeans from being placed on afterwards, because it is a messy thing. So it kind of makes sense that they would have checked her skirt if there was semen present within internally.
Yeah,
It
no,
being a
that
very messy, it being a very messy substance, it would go into a skirt, if that makes sense, especially
no,
considering her skirt
it
was pulled
absolutely does.
down.
An even better example for us in the U.S. is the Monica Lewinsky dress. How they were able to get semen off that, years later, to be able
Yeah,
to prove that happened. And
yeah.
from my understanding,
I
they even
completely
dry
forgot about
cleaned
her.
it, and they're still able to tell
Yeah,
that there's semen on it,
yeah,
which is really incredible. So they're able to get this DNA evidence. They still have their
yeah.
palm print, and
Mhm.
that's when they were able to run it in the national DNA database.
Yeah. So that's our equivalent to CODIS.
Right. And they get a pop on it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, they then obtain a suspect from that, which this is where my frustration starts. This is where I am genuinely so heartbroken for the original investigators. Would you like to introduce the suspect that they found?
yeah, so it's a 92-year-old, which I think that when you're looking at this case, first of all, there has to be a large assumption that your suspect is dead, given the age.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that that's got to be a struggle, because the more time and expense that you're putting into this case, at some point, you're really doing it or continuing to investigate it just on moral grounds and
Yeah.
not a lot of hope in actually bringing this
Yeah.
person to justice. But in
Yeah.
this case, they were lucky. They got a 92-year-old Ryland Headley.
Ryland Headley.
Headley. Okay.
I know we
knew I
have
was gonna
some very
butcher that
strange
name.
names.
All right.
Yeah. Ryland Headley.
But Ryan is 92 years old. He was
Mhm.
born in the West Indies, and then he immigrated to the UK. And we know that he lived about a mile and a half from her home during the time of the assault, which
Yep.
makes completely, sense. And what's really heartbreaking too is that he was right outside that perimeter that the original investigators were, going door to door and looking for suspects. So I think that for him, that's got to be nerve wracking if you see the police infiltrating a neighborhood and they're getting palm prints. And I'm sure everyone's talking about that. And he
Yeah.
had to be thinking, like, this is just a matter of time.
As soon as they widen that perimeter, he knows he's caught. It's funny you say it was quite nerve-wracking, because one of his neighbors who spoke to the press at the time of his arrest, they had something quite interesting to say about Ryland. He kept saying I'm directly quoting James Spencer, who was one of the neighbors. He kept saying to everyone that he's lucky to be in such a great neighborhood. He's lucky to have such great friends. He's lucky to have the cat. He's lucky to have his garden. He's lucky to have his fish. He was very appreciative of everything around him. The fact that he's lucky, he's lucky, he's lucky, he's lucky. He knew he was living on borrowed time.
I completely agree. And
His freedom was borrowed.
yeah, and I came to the same conclusion that you did. Here's actually a picture of him.
Mhm.
He's he looks like a 92-year-old with bags under his eyes and gray hair, but
Mm-mm.
he really did escape for a very long time. And it's interesting too when we look at his life around that time, how this isn't a loner that is walking the streets. I mean, he was married
Oh,
and had kids
yeah, father of
during the
3.
time of this assault.
Father of 3, married. Yeah, working
And
man.
yeah,
Got a job
he's got
every
a,
day.
a job working on a railway. But we know
Yep.
that between 1973 and 77, there was 10 burglaries that happened during that
Yes.
time that he was credited for.
Yes, I am so glad you brought up that time period and his little crime spree during that time period, because I did a bit of extra digging last night on that. I did some extra digging on that little crime spree because I got curious. Yeah,
Well, let's
Um,
hear about that
can
because you've
I?
also had 2
Yeah, if you
rapes,
wouldn't
right?
mind.
Yes, please go
Yes.
into it.
So, at least 10 burglaries between 1973 and 1977. This fascinates the ever living out of me because you're assuming that he may have been convicted of these burglaries individually. I'm assuming.
Right.
No,
So he was never charged.
he was charged um, for the burglaries at the same time as he was charged for the rapes that he committed in 1977 because they didn't know it was him. When they arrested him in 1977, early 78, no, 78 that he was sentenced. He was serving sentence, so 77 he was arrested. They didn't know that he had done the burglaries. They had him on fingerprints from one of the rapes. And when he pled guilty to the rapes, he then turned around and asked the judge to take into consideration, or to take into account 10 burglaries that he had committed between 73 and 77. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what's really
He just
interesting
confessed to it.
about with the burglary crime,
This is where the MO starts to shine through, especially when you get into the MO of the 2 rapes that were committed, which I did. I actually did look into those. I'm literally just trying to find the notes because unfortunately I dropped my notes last night and now they're all out of order.
well, let's
Um,
talk about these kind of burglaries and rapes too. I
yeah,
think that what kind of draws my attention to that is that that's one of the signs with serial killers is that you look for is that it's arson and it's burglaries, and the burglary isn't about stealing stuff. It's more of a voyeurism. They want
mhm,
to they get off on going into people's houses and seeing a potential victim, but they just don't follow through.
yep.
And so
So
you
it's
kind
like,
of see that progression of
yeah,
burglary and then raping, and then now you go to murder.
I think he broke the mold slightly because he went into burglary, rape, and murder all in one shot first. Then he went into burglary almost to tie himself over.
Yeah.
Sort of, yeah, I don't know. Sort of like a smoker would go into the smoking area to have, to just be around smokers instead of actually having a cigarette. Like playing
So
it
he's
safe
able to
almost.
control it enough by breaking in and maybe just seeing them and not actually
Mm.
going through with killing them.